Ingrid, what a joy it is to be with you online. At least we get to meet this way. Um, as I told you, warned you before, we are going to drill down into one of the four DNA strands. I sent the article to you, and it's going to be posted on
Yeah.
this in a link below this video. But one of them in particular is something that I'd like to talk to you about. But knowing that this link and the three others are all interconnected, so I'm sure the other three will come up, and we'll talk about all of them in
Yeah.
the end. But let's start with this, and then we'll see where it gets us to. So, first of all, thank you for your time. I know you're a very busy person, but
Oh, my
and I
pleasure.
think you've got a lot to share. So it's going to be a fun interview, a fun dialogue. Now, before we go into any of that stuff, could I ask you to introduce yourself, what you do in terms of your ministry, your life, so that people get an idea of who you are, where you're situated, and then we'll take it from there. Is that okay? Okay.
You betcha. So I am Ingrid. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the founding minister, the church planter of Weird Church in Cumberland, BC. That's on
Mhm.
Vancouver Island. If you're familiar with the island at all, we're about halfway up, about an hour and a bit north of Nanaimo. And I'm ordained in the United Church of Canada, and this is where I serve. I also, because our services are at 4 p.m., I get to do a lot of
Mm.
popping into different churches to help out doing pulpit supply and other kinds of fun things
So
throughout
tell us about the
throughout the
church.
month.
What's so weird about the church?
Well, for those of us who are part of the United Church,
Mm.
it's probably not actually that weird. um, on the surface of it, we have a building, we have different ministries that we do. We are in partnership to run a food program, we have children's programs, we
Mhm.
have truth and reconciliation team. We have a lot of the same on paper activities that a lot of United churches
Mhm.
do across and beyond the United Church, of course. But I think what we have in Weird Church is um, a congregation, a group of people, a community that is uh, actively seeking. And so, Weird Church is a place where we try
Mm.
to remove a lot of the barriers that might be there for folks to even
Mm.
consider walking into a church space or joining us on one of our forest meditation walks or joining us at
Mhm.
a paddleboard and kayak reflection time or like all of these different things. We try to remove a lot of the barriers, and so part of part of why we're even called Weird Church is
Right.
because it gets people's guard down. Um, Cumberland is also sort of nestled. There's three small communities all together, and Cumberland is one of those three. And it's always been sort of
Outliers.
I'll say the quirky one. like, and so it was historically, well,
Mm.
not all the way historically because it's got a huge history, but in recent memory, it's always
Mm.
been the place where it's more affordable to live. That is
Mm.
changing. It's hugely gentrifying right now, but it's always been the place where the artists have been, where there's been tons of creativity and exploration. And there is a hashtag that started about 10 years ago
Okay.
of Keep Cumberland Weird. Uh,
Right.
and so that was part of how the name came about was
Mhm.
a deep listening to the community. Um, and so the name itself helps people go, wait a second, Weird Church, what is that? And and then there we have a really casual sort of low liturgy,
Mm.
um, low
Mm.
barrier uh, entry point. So, like, I don't usually wear a collar and when I'm in church, and I often don't wear a stole when I'm leading services. And part of our service together is conversation, because we're sort of built on the values of equity and equality, and the fact that there's wisdom to be pulled from the wider group. And so like I might do some teaching and some preaching, but oftentimes what comes out in the conversation and from the wisdom of the gathered community is way more prophetic and way
Right.
wiser than anything I have to say.
Well, I mean, I'm taking
So
notes, and
yeah,
I'd like
yeah,
to circle back to what you just mentioned a little while ago about not using the collar, not using the stole as part of the
sure.
leadership piece. That's number four, the DNA strand. And like I said, it's all connected, right? But I'd like to
Yeah.
come back to that because you it's important. But coming back to number one, I think context is everything, as you know. And the fact that you named Weird Church after
Hmm.
the Cumberland, weird Cumberland piece is fascinating. So obviously you're listening to context, you're not kind of building something that's like a ivory
Yeah.
tower in the middle of nowhere. Um, Tell me a little bit about your uh, what we call congregation, parish, or your community of faith. Wh- What does it look like in terms of people who come there? What kind of diversity are we talking about, if possible?
Yeah. So our youngest ones are 2, 3 years
Hmm.
old, and our oldest ones are in their 90s. I would say the majority of our gathered group is
Okay,
20s,
so they're
30s,
still coming to
40s,
church. That's
maybe
great.
50s too, but sort of in that sort of, yeah, yeah. For a lot of them, they are,
Mm.
this is their first experience with church, or they are returning to church
Right.
after some trauma. So probably about 30 to 40% of our community would identify as part of the 2S LGBTQ plus community, coming from traditions where their gender identity or sexual orientation
Mhm.
is not
Mhm.
honored, celebrated, welcomed. Um, and so we have some folks coming from different traditions where
Mhm.
they're not welcome in their church that they grew up in. And then other folks who just have never been to church. Cumberland is like
Right.
peak spiritual, but not religious. And so lots of people are like, I find my church in the forest, or I
Right.
find my church on the ocean. And I'm like, me too,
Mhm.
and in community. And so I think so. We've got lots of queer folks. We've
Mm.
got a lot of people in the recovery community too, and so lots of people who have been really challenged with substance use disorder, addiction, whether that is drugs, alcohol, or other forms of addiction. We try to be really open and engaged in making sure that folks know that like you don't
Right.
have to be these 5 things. You don't have like, and we really try to encourage lack of perfection, which is great for me because I am not perfect. And so we sort of joke about when technology goes wrong or when I get
It's okay.
lost in what I'm saying, like,
It's
look,
okay.
you can
Yeah,
be the leader of the church
I like that.
and not be perfect. Yeah. So there's a really strong emphasis on not having it all figured out. um, we
Mm.
recently added our second staff person who is working with in the United Church. We use the term first third,
Mhm.
so those in their first third of life, so children, youth, and young adults. And we have lots of young people that were
Mm.
showing up, and we had to figure out how to engage them differently. We try to still stay together um, as a whole community at least once a month to do like more tactile engagement that crosses all ages, all neurodiverse expressions, like
Mm.
sort of ways that you can engage in spiritual practice no matter how you do that. We also have a lot of folks on in that neurodiverse category. So lots of folks
Mm.
with ADHD,
Mm.
autism, different diversities, and we try to make services on Sunday and other ways that we engage in practice accessible, not only whether you are able-bodied or not, but also depending on the way that
Right.
different brains learn.
Right.
So trying not to have super bright lights, trying to keep sound so that it's
Right.
like manageable for
Mm.
lots of different folks. So
That's
yeah,
that's fascinating.
yeah. And we've also got some like tried, tested, and
Yeah, of
true Cradle
course.
United Church people. And typically every service has at least one, if not two, three, four, five clergy, because we meet at four. So we have folks from we have chaplain from the base whose family comes. We have Anglicans who come. We have retired United Church, active United Church. Like there's lots of folks don't who need a place to
Yeah,
come when they're not in their
yeah.
like acting service. And so that's been a
That's neat
really
because
beautiful
they are
gift to the
also looking
community
for a
as
place
well.
to be
Yeah,
ministered to, right? And to get something, which they don't when they have a service at 10 o'clock. Yeah.
exactly.
So that's fascinating. And I'd like to know, you said you're the pioneer of this church. I mean, you pioneered this, you started this, right? How did you get from where you were to where you are now? What are some of the things that as you look back, what are some of the key markers?
Well, COVID sure didn't help. We started in
Oh,
September
really?
of
Okay.
2018, and so there's been like real
Hmm.
COVID bumps along the way. Um, but a lot of what we did at the beginning was just
Right.
try stuff. We just tried. And I got really uncomfortable for a long time. I got comfortable with being uncomfortable. So, like, only having one person or two people or three people show up, having nobody show up, learning to come prepared with a book so that I could sit and read in whatever thing that I
Hmm.
was getting ready to do.
But if I can stop you there,
And
if I can just stop you
the
there,
other thing,
what even made
yeah,
you dream of this, think of this? What did you have in mind? It's obviously not like a traditional United Church, right? So why did you even start this? What was going on in your mind?
yeah. Well, I never meant to have a worshiping congregation. That was actually
Mhm.
not what we set out to do. Um, the so I was serving at the next closest United Church, St. George's United in Courtenay,
Yep.
which is about 10 minutes down the road. And the United Church in
Mm.
Cumberland was closing, and some of us from St. George's reached out to try to essentially walk alongside people through the process
Mm.
of grieving and letting go of the community that had been there. I mean, the church was it was a Presbyterian church before, but the building was finished in
Mm.
1895. So it was a part of that community for a really long time, and there was a huge amount of grief. Um, and the folks who were part of the community couldn't
Mm.
articulate what they needed in that time, I think because their
Mm.
grief was really strong. Um, and at that time, they were down to about 12 people,
Yeah.
the same 12
Yeah.
people who were doing all the things and working so hard for all
Went
those
out.
years, and they just couldn't do it anymore. And St. George's at that time, it still is, was a really thriving community and of about 150 people. And so to go, like we said, well, you can come. And they're like, it's pretty big. I don't know. So there was
Mhm.
some reluctance there. And so I sort of changed tact and I said, okay, instead of how can we help, what I asked was, what are you going to miss the
Mm.
most about your community? And they said, having coffee and talking about things that really matter.
Mm.
Okay. So then one of the hats I was wearing at St. George's was community outreach. And so what we came up with was this idea of a once a month, almost like a ministry outreach project of hosting coffee and conversations that matter. That was the first sort of, that
Mm.
was the beginning of Weird Church. And so it was a ministry of St. George's, and we started meeting. I made up some posters. We just wanted to get people in a coffee shop to have like a bit of a
Mm.
curated conversation with a
Gotcha.
spiritual kind of basis, but really not religious. Yeah. And so um, I was thinking that we were going to be hosting this coffee conversation for the folks whose church had just closed. And so we put up posters, we sent emails out, and nobody from the church came. But 8
Wow.
people from the community
Wow.
came.
Hmm.
And we were like, hmm. So then we did it again the next month, and 12 people came. Some people came back. Okay. So then that was right at the same time that it was BC Conference at the time, it's now the Pacific Mountain region of the United Church, had grant money for um,
Hmm.
exploring new forms of ministry. And so we applied for a grant. We applied for a we got it all together. We applied for a grant with a quarter time salary so that I would
Right.
be able to do
Right.
some of these things in
Yeah.
Cumberland to sort of
Yeah.
see what we were doing. And we got a grant for a
Okay.
half-time salary and some expenses. And so that was a huge stepping stone because it wasn't a $2,000 grant. It
Mm-hmm.
was like a chunk of money that gave me as a staff person some space to be able to not worry
Right.
about where my paycheck was coming from, but to really invest some time in the community. And so um, I had been part of a church plant when I did my undergrad in New York City, and I had been to the Inhabit conference to learn about emerging ministries. I had been to
Mm-hmm.
Greenbelt and learning about fresh expressions in the UK. So this was all
Hmm.
sort of in my, well, let's be real. It wasn't part of my wheelhouse. I really didn't know what I was doing, but it was familiar. And so I was very present in the community and we just started trying things. And it
Mm-hmm.
happened really organically. So from that Coffee and Conversations That Matter group, someone said, "Hey, have you ever heard of Forest Church?" Well, I had heard of Forest Church. I had read about it. I had participated in it in the UK when I was over there. And I was like, "Yeah, you want to do it?" They were like, "Yes, I do." So then we tried Forest Church, and it was basically like a walking meditation. It was a liturgy in the woods, but it was very casual, very
Hmm.
colloquial, very invitational.
Wow.
Well, people started showing up for that. And then someone else said, "Hey, have you ever heard of a snowshoe pilgrimage?" I said, "No, but let's do it." And she was teaching snowshoeing on the local mountains, about a 20-minute drive from Cumberland. So we did a snowshoe pilgrimage, and 15 people came.
Hmm.
And it was this slow
Hmm.
organic listening and responding to what people were asking for, um, alongside prayer, discernment, study, and going, okay, yeah, that, because I think some of the gap that happens of why people leave church or don't even think of church is because they don't know that some of these beautiful things are
Hmm.
also part of our tradition. Like if you read the Psalms, you know that the
Hmm.
forests are alive. They are teeming with the presence of God, right? And so giving people language to connect the dots
Hmm.
between ancient tradition and present day experience is really so much of what we do. Um,
Well, of course. I mean,
can I
just
keep
keep
going
going.
for a minute
Don't
or
stop.
is that okay?
Don't stop.
Okay, okay. So then something really interesting happened is we were meeting in this coffee shop and outside, but we were starting to be a group of about
Okay.
20, 25 people, which when we met at the
Yes,
coffee shop
exactly.
took up the whole coffee shop
Right.
because it's just a little
Well, the coffee
place.
shop manager must have been
And
glad because he
so
sold his coffee, right?
the
The,
well, she did come to me afterwards, the owner, and she was like, "Look, Ingrid," and I had built good relationship with her, right? So she was like, "I'm really happy that you're bringing this business in, but whenever your group is here, nobody else can get in." And so she's like, "I love you. I love what you're doing, but can you
oh,
try to
really?
find another place to
Wow.
be?" Okay, yeah.
Hmm.
And so one of I mean, this can be only God's good arrangement. Um, One person from the old church had started to
Hmm.
come to our gatherings, and I had mentioned this, like, okay, folks, we need to find a new place. Maybe we'll just meet outside for now. And she's like, I still have the key to the old church because the church building had been put up for sale,
Okay,
but it hadn't sold yet.
that's weird.
So we just sort of went up the street to the church, and I called uh, I called the executive minister at the
Yeah.
time, or Doug Goodwin, and I said, "We're gonna go use the church,"
Uh-oh.
and he said no, and then I did it anyway. And I mean, that's sort of the joke is that we got
Right.
our start church squatting
Yeah.
because we had the key and Doug was all the way in Burnaby.
Uh,
So we uh we
yeah.
he did say yes. He
Yeah.
did say yes. His first thought was like no, and with good reason, right? His argument was that this big old building was going to um hamper. It was going to
Mm.
hinder the ministry, not help it. And he really wanted to make sure that this
Mm.
little fledgling
Wouldn't that
something
kind of, yes.
didn't end up in the same place that
Right.
so many communities are
Yeah.
building, right? So um, he eventually said you can use it, but only until it sells, and then you got to figure something else out. Okay, fine, fine. Um, and with that space, uh, with that old space, with over 100 years of prayer and song and story and wedding and baptism and communion, with all of that in that space, um, the
Mm.
community shifted because in the coffee shop, it was a bit of a fishbowl and things just got a bit more intimate. We had couches set up, like it was still very casual. We had coffee, like I started, there were still coffee makers and cups and stuff
Yeah.
in the kitchen. So I just brought them out and started making coffee there. And but the dynamic of
Mm.
the community shifted and things got more vulnerable, more intimate. And because we had this big space, we were able to start doing more things. So we started community dinners, uh, which we called Friday Feast, which was totally something I stole from what Bethel was doing at UBC at that time with Aaron. But it was a chance to, so we would face the pews to each other, put tables with paper and candles and markers, and we had local musicians come in, we had food, we had poets share, and that ended up becoming part of our rhythm for a year. We had coffee and conversations that matter. We had uh, Forest Church ended up becoming Weird Church in the Woods, and we had Friday Feast. And these were sort of our regular
Mm.
rhythm of gatherings, and real community was forming. And
Ingrid, so yes, just keep carrying on. So I've got Ingrid, so yes, just keep carrying on. So I've got another question, and I've got a whole lot of questions to ask you. But Ingrid, so interesting the way that you have uh, the way that God has actually led you through this process, and starting from a place of just vulnerability and asking God to lead, rather than having something in place and have your building and the typical church planting model, right? You start with nothing in a place
yeah,
outside church and you grew into this. But um, you said you added one uh, part-time staff member and yourself is the other staff. But in terms of you and a leadership team and things, how do you keep this sense of hopefulness? How do you keep the sense of learning, innovation, experimenting going in your leadership and your congregation as well? What do you do? What are some of the things you do to?
well, I think that I'm probably the biggest barrier to that, even though I am like the one who sort of got things rolling. The I had so much training in seminary of like, when a congregation is this
Right,
size, here's what you need. When a congregation is this
right,
size, here's what you need. And And I've worked in so many churches, in so many presbyteries, in so many different areas that I tend, like at the beginning when everything was fresh and new and I was just like, ooh, trying to figure things out, it was easy to be entrepreneurial,
Mm-hmm.
experimental. And what I found myself happening lately is I keep
Right.
defaulting to these church settings. We get to a certain, because what has happened is we have a strong core community now. And Sunday worship is usually about 50 people. It
Mm.
fluctuates a lot, but if everybody showed up on a Sunday, which, I mean, I guess every church says this, we probably have
Mm.
about 80 people. And so it's big enough now that I don't have the same ability to be in conversation, to be in
Mm-hmm.
relationship
Right.
as with the little
Right.
fledgling church. And so I tend to go, right, we need committees and we need teams and we need these things. And I have to keep checking myself and go like, no, if this really is an experiment in how we do church differently and how we engage and how we really listen and respond to the needs of the community um, through the discerning lens of the Holy Spirit, like I can't just default to building the same structures that basically aren't working anymore, right? Or aren't working for a lot of
Mm.
churches, I'll say. Some of them are still
Mm.
doing really well. And so I think uh, one of the beautiful things of being in a community where people don't have the same kind of church experience is they go, well, do we have to do
Right.
it that way? Do we have to do it that way? And I'm like, no, we shouldn't do it that way. Why am I doing this?
Mm.
And so, like, what what we've been doing over the last year is building up our leadership team. They have self-identified as the God Squad, and so we have a group of. We went through sort of a spiritual gifts inventory, and then from that are trying to sort of work to people's greatest gifts. Um, and so one of our God Squad has an MBA. She's amazing, really gifted, understands like the administration and all of these things about organizational systems. But that really tires her out.
Mm-hmm.
So she loves to do land acknowledgements and she loves to do expressions of connection between spirit and land and trees and
Mm.
water. And so even though she's really
Mm.
good at like systems
Mm.
management, that's not what she's
Right.
doing in
Right.
leadership,
Right.
right? And so part of it is that. But the other thing that we're trying is trying to explore different governance structures. So the United Church wants us to eventually be our own community of faith, because right now
Yes.
we're still a ministry of the region.
Yes.
So we have support from the regional church, which is so important that I'm so grateful for, especially tax receipts.
Yeah.
But we get a lot of support from the region. But the idea is that, like, in the same way that we're weaning off of grant money, we also want to wean off of those supports. And so we're building our leadership capacity in terms of like writing and managing our own budgets, those kinds of like things that we need to do. But we also are trying to figure out alternative governance structures and ones that work in terms of the values that we've identified.
Mm.
And so we've been thinking what we're trying on right now is this idea of the Weird Church ecosystem. That's like a big garden. And so within the Weird Church ecosystem, we have a lot of community partners that we do things with. And so we have the garden bed that is Weird Church, that is like our youth programs and our Sunday services and all these things. So that in our garden bed, there's a bunch of different plants that we tend. We have to weed and everything. But then there's other garden beds in our ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have a big compost pile that we are not afraid to use. and and so just looking at governance in more of this ecosystem model than some of the things that I default to. And
Mm.
being really comfortable with the natural life cycles of the garden. Some plants are annuals, some plants are perennials.
Right.
We always need to be getting weeds out.
Right.
And we know that some flowers or some plants are going to seed, and the seeds are going to go outside of our garden box and maybe even outside of our ecosystem. And that's really awesome. And we can celebrate that instead
Right.
of trying to keep all of our seeds in our box. And so we're trying to really live our values in our structures.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But it was a big gap between throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what works and finding some rhythms to getting to this place of we actually have like a committed core group of people. We have people on par, like so we have we're not fully financially sustainable yet, but we're actually pretty close.
Getting there.
And so like that gap um, was not easy, and that gap happened through COVID as well.
Mm. Oh, okay. I love the idea of the ecosystem. I think that gives you permission to hold the two things in tension, which is organizational growth and organizational life phase, and you need to experiment, be innovative, and grow and be organic, right? I think the
Yeah,
ecosystem gives that the permission to do that because, um, yeah, in the ecosystem, everything is interdependent on each other. Whether it's a rain,
exactly.
sun, compost, growth, death, all life, all of that, right? That's
Totally.
great. And I think I'm glad I'm doing the interview because these are things that people who are in places where the church is quote unquote dying might want to actually think about, that they move to a different kind of a way of thinking about church. Not so much mechanical, but organic. And the ecosystem is a
It's
beautiful place to work in.
it's something I think about a lot, about the church across the country and particularly in rural settings.
Mhm.
Like the Cumberland has about 4,500 residents, so it's not very big.
Not big. Mhm.
And um, I do I do supervision for Denman Island United Church, which is a population of about 2,000. They don't have a ministry; it's a
Oh,
lay-led
yeah.
community. And I go up and I do services once a month in Port McNeill, which is at the very north end of the Vancouver Islands, about two and a half
Uh-huh.
hours from here. And I see the challenges and the struggles of these remote communities, and I also see how some of the things that we've been allowed to do because we're a ministry of the region as opposed to our own community of faith
Mm.
have given us a little bit more breathing space.
Understand. Yeah.
And I mean, there's things that are more challenging because we're a ministry of as opposed to our own community of
Right.
faith. Like
Right.
I see the pluses and minuses in both
Yeah.
things, but
Yeah.
there's a certain kind of elasticity and flexibility that we have that um, other communities don't. And it's like, okay, how can we take the learning from what we're doing here and make it applicable across Canada for some of these other places that are doing really good, important community work, and that the community would suffer if they weren't there? Like, not just the church community, but the whole neighborhood would suffer from a loss of their presence. How can we take some of the learning that we're doing and and disciple it, sort of,
Well,
right?
I mean, the reality of it is that um, when you start getting organized, then you start fitting under the umbrella and the rubric of the organization, which is the denomination, right? And they have certain rules and regulations that you must follow.
Yeah.
And that could or may not suck the life out of you. So keeping this tension between that and being this flexible, malleable, new is a real. And I think going back to the ecosystem model, I think that's where there is possibility of doing that
Yeah.
in a way that doesn't compromise either. But I want to get back also to the something else I said at the beginning, the whole leadership model that the leadership, the kind of leadership that you exude in your community. You mentioned a gift-based kind of, you did a gift inventory, And one of the four DNA strands that is quoted is having a empowering, gift-based ministry leadership model. So you kind of you're living that out. And earlier you talked about not having a stole with you when you preach, or not even wearing a collar. And I just want to, I think, affirm the fact that I think you're onto something which a lot of churches um, are, don't know about, and that is that leadership is not about one person,
Hmm.
but it's about empowering the entire body of Christ, the community, to lead via their gifts. So this woman you talked about, who has an MBA, who's a skill, who's a learned skill of through an MBA, she's actually using her gifts and not her real skill,
Yeah.
which is great, because that's what leadership is about, right? God gives us gifts and use it for the community. I just want to affirm you in that.
Thank
It's
you.
great.
Thank you. It's
Now,
it's I mean, it's tempting because she knows the things that I
oh,
don't know, and it's like
absolutely.
it's tempting to want to draw on that, but it's a drain for her, and like
Well,
it doesn't it's antithetical to what we are trying to do, right? Yeah.
well, I mean, many accountants end up as bookkeepers of the church, right?
Yeah.
And they don't want, that's the last thing they want to do, because they're doing it from Monday to Friday.
Yeah.
So, the fact that you can identify gifts and call people to exercise those gifts is great. Just moving on, I just want to find out, in terms of uh, your faith and witness and spiritual growth and all of that, or the other two DNA strands, how do you encourage that in your congregation? What are some of the things, practices that you might have in place that encourage people to dig deeper into their spiritual growth and look outward in terms of their witness and and proclamation and yeah, just witness in the world. How do you kind of help people to grow in those two areas?
I think that there's, for me, uh, spiritual community, religious community is about the the commons, like the communal experience of being together.
Mm,
I really don't think that you can be a Christian by yourself. Like I
mm-hmm.
like that's just one of my core beliefs.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
and I also don't think that it's an individual, like I don't think it's only individual or only collective. It has to be this movement back and forth and this constant conversation between um, like my own work and the work that we do together. And I think that that is part of the DNA of the community, is that like, okay, we can't do this. I think part I think some of this has to do with the fact that I have flowed between the evangelical church and the United Church, where I would say
Mm-hmm.
the United Church often defaults to the collective, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of like we we have our food bank, we do this work, our faith has hands and feet, and we're in the community, right?
Right.
And
Right.
the evangelical church, which tends to default to the individual,
Right.
and neither one works on its own, in my experience. It has to be this
Mm-hmm.
flow back and forth. And so I think that that is sort of built into the way that we operate and exist as a community. And so there is this push into like deep spiritual individual work, deep conversation with God on an ongoing basis of like, hey, have you chatted to God about that today? It's very like that whole idea of Abba, Father, Daddy, like it's very casual,
Mm-hmm.
colloquial, and drawing from 12-step work, there's this idea of conscious contact with God. And so if we're
Mm-hmm.
in conscious contact with God throughout our day, throughout our week, it allows God to do that transforming work within us where we can let go of hate, where we can let go of fear, where we can let go of anger, and we can be our authentic selves. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and the only way we practice this new kind of transformation is in loving community. And so it's in the loving community where we get to show up and dare to say, I am a beloved child of God. I am worthy of love. Um, and so are you. And so it allows for that individual and that collective transformation. And it's just this constant movement in and out, um,
Mm.
that I think makes it so special. And so, yeah, January 17th, our youth group is doing a food drive because we have a 24-hour access food pantry, and the supplies are getting low. So yes, we're like
Mm.
collecting food, making sure everybody has enough to eat. And
Right.
like the last youth group event was a forest meditation where young people are invited to breathe in and out, you know, and connect with their deep rootedness in and their place of belonging in God's great creation.
Mm.
Both of these
Mm.
things have to happen.
Right. I've heard it said your faith is personal but not
Yeah.
private, or something like that. And then how do you, you just talked about a little while ago, but how do you encourage your people to live out their faith in their Monday to Saturday lives? You mentioned youth, for
Yeah.
example, doing this food drive, but are there any stories you can tell us about how people actually make a difference and they're living out their lives uh, in the week? I'm sure there are many, but
Well, I can share a couple of stories.
yeah, what are you
One
hearing?
story is, there was last year there was an act of violence against a trans youth in our community, not in our church community, but in our neighborhood. And
Hmm.
this was really traumatic for the whole queer community, and really the whole town. And because we have, you know, because we have flags and posters and are really outwardly public, intentional, and explicit with our welcome, the community came to us and said, we need some help.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
I think, and so then we were able to open the doors of the church, have a vigil, have some healing, have some of those things. But it's because of the way that our members show up in the community that even happened. And so I think I think that there's a way that we walk differently in all aspects of our life when we start to really
Hmm.
believe our belovedness, when we start to really truly feel that sense that the Spirit is within and around, and when our faith um, uh, allows us to breathe. And
Hmm.
it's not it's not a directive, right? It's not like, actually, usually I am a directive at the end of every service. I remind people of their belovedness and say, like,
Right.
can you imagine if you really walked this in the world, what would happen? And so that is sort of directive,
Hmm.
but just that that full immersion in the experience of, I am precious, I am loved, I am safe, I am forgiven, whatever that person needs in that day. um, it spills out into their life in this real, like, chorus kind of way, like we are filled up to the point of overflow, and it spills out. And so I think some of the way
Hmm.
that people practice that in their day-to-day lives is that walking of love, and that that seeing no stranger in the other, right? And that
Hmm. Hmm.
translates in community, and it changes people and it changes
Hmm.
neighborhoods, and it's not
Hmm.
necessarily explicit in the way, like I remember when I was part of an evangelical church in New York City, we used to show up at like university registration lines with bottles of water and granola bars that said like John
Right.
3:16, God loves you, come to our church, right? Like that was really like
Yeah.
evangelical.
Yeah. in your
Yeah.
face.
And
Yeah.
I mean, it worked. And that sometimes is what people need to know. They need to be reminded that
Mhm.
like, you are gifted, called, and chosen. You are mine. Like,
It's
yeah,
again context, right?
it's,
Context
it's,
again.
and
Yeah,
that worked there. And that is, um, not something that would work in our context, but
that's
in
right.
the way that people are, I think, being filled up and engaging in the community and then existing in the neighborhood as like beacons of light and love and hope, people are drawn into that. And they're like, there's been so many stories of people who are like, what has happened to you? Why are you so happy? And they're like, I started going to church. They're like, what? No, what have you done? And they're like, no,
Yeah.
it's not like that. You got to come check this out. We're doing different things. And
Right,
so,
right.
um,
Mm,
it's, it's, it's a lot less, yeah, directive than that. Um, but there is this pull
mm.
in that is, um, I don't know that I have words for it exactly, except, when you're having a really good conversation and someone kind of leans in, it's almost
Yeah.
like that,
Yes.
but
LinkedIn. Yeah.
it's slow,
Mhm.
right? When
Mm.
we used to go do those drives and hand out bottles of water and granola bars in the lineup at NYU, 50 people would show up the next Sunday. This is not like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Someone
Slow.
in
Yes.
seminary, I wish I could remember who said it or it was a book I read. I'm sure someone will know where this comes from. Said the kingdom of God moves at the speed of relationship. That
I've heard
works
it
for
said
me.
too. Yeah. It is. Yeah. I can go on forever, but we can't. I'm going to kind of draw it to a close. But before we close, this journey of yours from 2018 to now, I'm sure hasn't come without challenges. What are some of the challenges that you can kind of name just off the top of your head before we kind of wind down?
I would say the biggest challenge is my own fear, and and so when I get out of I have pretty rigorous spiritual practice, and when I get out of my practice and into my fear and I start worrying too much about budgets and floorboards and bathrooms and leaking roofs and things like
Mm,
that, um, everything stops. And when I lean in the direction of yes, when I say yes and I really listen, um, things start flowing again. And um,
mm,
by all like churchy markers and merits that we try to follow, this thing should not be working, but it is.
right. That's how God works.
In spite of
In
me,
spite of
God
those
is up
things,
to
right?
something here, and I just have to keep getting out of God's way.
So if you were to give advice to a pastor who's watching this video and says, you know what, I'm inspired. I want to even attempt something like this. What words of advice would you give maybe a young pastor who's trying this? Maybe John, as he's looking at ministry. What would you tell the pastor?
Yeah, take a deep
Take
breath.
a
That
deep breath
really is it.
first.
Um, to maintain deep daily practice, because God will tell you exactly what you need to know, but not more. Like, it is a daily mana
Mm,
situation. I wish I could do more longer term planning, but so far, every time I try to do that, it does not work. It really is a daily mana type of
mm,
situation through that I need to be
mhm,
engaged in listening with God on a daily basis for that to happen. And that stuff is not going to work. And that doesn't mean you should stop trying. Things we have tried so many things that didn't work, and like, just not to give up, because I really believe that like God has a job for each one of us, and as we come to believe that we might actually be called to this thing that is right in front of us and step into that role in leadership, like, let me try that again.
mm.
as we are called into leadership in the church that we love, the church that we hate, the church that frustrates us and makes us want to tear our hair out and run away screaming, but keeps drawing us back in. We have a role to play,
Mm-hmm.
and the role that we have to play matters. And some of it is accepting with humility the things that didn't work, but not letting it turn to humiliation, right? It's all
Right.
learning.
Because all learning, right?
And
Every,
you know,
yeah.
the the beautiful part about it is that God doesn't give up on us
Right.
ever.
Perfect. We should do this 3 or 4 times because you got so much to share. But thank you so much, Ingrid. I'm really grateful for your time. And not just your time, but just your willingness to share and be vulnerable because not many pastors will tell me that they failed, quote unquote.
I've done more failing
It's
than
been a
not.
learning.
So
And
yeah,
all fear
yeah.
is learning, all failure is learning. And I mean, the fact that you even said that you're fearful is something that a lot of people won't admit, but it's important because God does lots of good things through our own weaknesses.
Thank you
So,
for
so
thank you
thank
for
you.
the
To learn
Yeah.
more
invitation to
about the
share our
Reverend
story.
Ingrid Brown and her church, visit weirdchurchcumberland.com.